A high-stakes board meeting in a glass-walled conference room on the 42nd floor of a Manhattan skyscraper. 12 executives in designer suits debate a hostile takeover bid worth $300 million, their voices rising as tempers flare over strategy and numbers. Nobody notices when the janitor enters to empty the trash bins. Why would they? She's invisible to people like this, just another woman in a uniform doing menial work while important people make important decisions. When one executive accidentally knocks his coffee cup onto the floor, he doesn't apologize or even acknowledge her as she kneels to clean the spill. Instead, he makes a joke to his colleagues about the help getting in the way of real work. The room erupts in laughter. The woman cleaning coffee off Italian marble doesn't look up, doesn't react, just finishes wiping the spill with quiet efficiency. Then she stands, looks directly at the executive who'd mocked her, and says something that makes every person in that room go absolutely silent. What happened in the next 3 minutes didn't just humble a room full of arrogant executives, it became a viral moment that sparked conversations about class, dignity, and the dangerous assumption that someone's job defines their worth. Stay with me, because this story is about to reveal why you should never, ever underestimate the person you think is beneath you. Let me introduce you to Elena Petrova, because understanding what happened in that boardroom requires knowing who she really was beneath that janitor's uniform. Elena was born in Moscow in 1952, during the height of the Soviet era, to parents who were both professors. Her father taught mathematics, her mother literature. Elena inherited their intellectual gifts, excelling in school and eventually earning degrees in economics and business administration from Moscow State University, one of the most prestigious institutions in Russia. By her 30s, Elena was working as an economic advisor to Soviet officials, analyzing market systems and providing strategic guidance during the tumultuous period of economic reform in the late 1980s. She was brilliant, respected, and positioned for significant influence in the new Russia that was emerging as the Soviet Union collapsed. But history had other plans. The economic chaos of the early 1990s destroyed careers, fortunes, and futures. Elena's expertise became a liability when the officials she'd advised fell from power during political upheavals. By 1995, facing economic ruin and political persecution for her associations with the old regime, Elena made the wrenching decision that millions of immigrants have made throughout history. She left everything behind and came to America. Elena arrived in New York in 1996 at age 44 with 2 suitcases, limited English, and credentials that meant nothing in a country that didn't recognize Soviet degrees or care about her professional achievements. The American dream that immigrants are promised looks very different when you're living it, especially when you're middle-aged, female, and starting over in a society that measures worth by current position rather than past accomplishments or inherent capability. Elena took the only jobs she could get: cleaning offices at night, working as a home health aide, doing the invisible labor that keeps American cities functioning while the people benefiting from that labor rarely think about who's providing it. For most immigrants in Elena's position, this becomes their permanent reality. They work themselves to exhaustion in jobs that native-born Americans won't do, send money back to family in their home countries, and die having never recovered the status and security they'd once had. But Elena had a plan that nobody around her suspected. While cleaning offices at night, Elena was doing something that her employers and the executives whose trash she emptied would have found impossible to believe. She was studying. Elena would arrive hours early for her cleaning shifts and spend that time reading financial newspapers and reports left on executives' desks, teaching herself about American business practices, market systems, and investment strategies. She was learning English not from classes, but from reading the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg reports, and financial analysis that executives would leave lying around, never imagining that the woman mopping their floors was absorbing information that they barely understood despite their Ivy League degrees. Elena would later say that those years of invisible observation taught her more about American capitalism than any business school could have. She saw how decisions were really made, how egos drove strategy more than analysis, how often executives succeeded through confidence and connections rather than actual competence. By the early 2000s, Elena had saved enough money from her multiple jobs to make small investments in the stock market. She applied the analytical skills she'd honed as an economic advisor in Russia, combined with the insider knowledge she'd gained from reading confidential reports while cleaning offices, to make investment decisions that consistently outperformed the market. She never had access to true insider information that would be illegal, but she had something perhaps more valuable: the ability to read patterns, understand market psychology, and make decisions based on rigorous analysis rather than emotional reactions or groupthink that dominated boardroom decisions she'd witnessed. Her initial investment of $3,000 painfully saved over 2 years grew to $15,000 within 18 months. She reinvested everything, lived more frugally than ever, and continued working her cleaning jobs while building an investment portfolio that was growing at rates that would have impressed professional fund managers. Over 15 years, Elena transformed herself from a broke immigrant cleaning offices into a wealthy investor with a portfolio worth tens of millions of dollars. She did this so quietly that nobody in her life knew. She continued working as a janitor, not because she needed the money, but because the position gave her access and invisibility. She could observe, learn, and identify investment opportunities that others missed. She saw which companies had toxic cultures that would eventually destroy shareholder value. She identified startups that had genuine innovation versus those that were just good at selling investors on empty promises. And critically, she developed expertise in identifying companies ripe for acquisition, firms that were undervalued by markets but had fundamental strengths that strategic buyers would pay premium prices to acquire. By 2019, Elena had accumulated enough wealth to start acquiring positions in companies herself, eventually building a portfolio of strategic investments that made her one of the most successful under-the-radar investors in New York. Which brings us to that board meeting in November 2023. The company whose executives were debating a hostile takeover bid was called Ameritech Solutions, a mid-sized technology firm specializing in cybersecurity. The hostile bid had come from a rival company backed by a consortium of private equity firms, and Ameritech's board was divided on how to respond. Some executives wanted to accept the offer and cash out their stock options for massive payouts. Others wanted to fight the takeover, believing they could deliver more value by remaining independent. The meeting had been going for 3 hours, tempers were fraying, and nobody was making progress toward consensus. Elena entered the room as she did every evening at 6 o'clock to empty trash and do basic cleaning. She'd been working as a janitor in this building for 12 years, and most of the executives had seen her hundreds of times without ever really seeing her at all. What none of those executives knew, what they couldn't have imagined despite all their market intelligence and due diligence, was that Elena Petrova owned 22% of Ameritech Solutions. She'd been accumulating shares for 3 years, buying quietly through various investment vehicles to avoid triggering disclosure requirements until she'd built a position large enough to be significant. 22% made Elena the second largest shareholder in the company. More than that, Elena had been coordinating with other major shareholders who were dissatisfied with current management, building a coalition that collectively controlled 43% of the company's stock. Elena hadn't just been cleaning offices, she'd been executing a strategy to take control of a company that she'd identified as fundamentally sound but poorly managed. The hostile takeover bid that had sparked this emergency board meeting wasn't a threat to Elena's investment, it was an opportunity she'd been waiting for. When that executive knocked his coffee cup onto the floor and made his dismissive joke about the help, he had no idea he was mocking the person who would soon control his professional future. Elena finished cleaning the spill, stood up, and in that moment made a decision that would change everything. Instead of continuing her invisibility, instead of waiting for the proper moment to reveal her position through lawyers and official channels, Elena chose to announce herself in the most dramatic way possible. She looked at the executive who'd mocked her. His name was Bradley Henderson, VP of Operations, a man who'd inherited his position through family connections and had spent the entire meeting grandstanding about his strategic vision while contributing nothing of substance. Elena's English, which she'd perfected over 27 years in America, carried no trace of accent as she spoke. "Mr. Henderson, I believe you dropped something else besides your coffee. Your dignity, perhaps?" The room went silent. Henderson stared at her, confused and irritated that the janitor had spoken to him at all, let alone with apparent criticism. "Excuse me?" he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "I think you should stick to cleaning and leave the business discussions to people who understand them." Several executives shifted uncomfortably even in a room full of privilege. Henderson's naked contempt felt excessive. Elena smiled slightly, reached into her cleaning cart, and pulled out something nobody expected, a leather portfolio containing documents. She placed it on the conference table and said 8 words that would become legendary in business circles. I understand them better than you ever will. She opened the portfolio and began distributing copies of a document to everyone in the room. As executives looked at the papers with growing confusion and then shock, Elena explained, "My name is Elena Petrova, and I own 22% of this company. I've been observing your leadership for 3 years, and I've concluded that your management team is destroying shareholder value through incompetence, ego, and a complete inability to execute coherent strategy. This hostile takeover bid that you've spent 3 hours arguing about, I know who's behind it. I know their financing, and I know their plan. I also know that you're planning to accept their offer despite it being significantly undervalued, primarily because most of you are more interested in cashing out your stock options than in actually building long-term value." The room had transformed from confused silence to absolute pandemonium. The CEO, Richard Brennan, finally found his voice. "This is impossible. Who are you really? What kind of scam is this?" Elena pulled out additional documents, stock ownership records, investment histories, letters from her attorneys confirming her position. Everything was legitimate, verified, and completely shocking to people who'd spent years walking past her without a second glance. Elena continued, her voice calm but carrying absolute authority. "I've been coordinating with other major shareholders who share my concerns about current management. Together, we control 43% of this company. We're prepared to vote against the current takeover offer, remove the existing board and CEO, and install new leadership that will actually create value rather than destroying it through vanity projects and strategic incompetence." Bradley Henderson, still trying to process that the woman he'd mocked was apparently a major shareholder, sputtered, "This is insane. You're a janitor. How could you possibly?" Elena cut him off. "I am a janitor, Mr. Henderson. I'm also an economist, an investor, and soon to be the controlling shareholder of this company. Your mistake, the mistake all of you have made, is assuming that someone's current job defines their capability or worth. I've spent 3 years watching you make terrible decisions, ignore warning signs, and prioritize your egos over the company's health. I clean your offices, so I see the documents you carelessly leave lying around. I hear your conversations. I observe who actually works and who just performs work. And I've concluded that almost none of you deserve your positions." Elena then did something that demonstrated why she was actually qualified to control the company. She delivered a 15-minute presentation on Ameritech's strategic position, competitive advantages, market opportunities, and specific recommendations for how the company should respond to the takeover bid and restructure operations for long-term success. Her analysis was more sophisticated, better informed, and more strategically sound than anything the executives had discussed in their 3-hour meeting. She cited specific projects that were hemorrhaging money, detailed how the company's cybersecurity products were superior to competitors but were being poorly marketed, and outlined a restructuring plan that would cut costs without damaging operations. Every executive in that room recognized, with varying degrees of humiliation, that this woman in a janitor's uniform understood their business better than they did. The CEO, recognizing that Elena's threat was legitimate and that she held genuine power, tried to negotiate. "Ms. Petrova, perhaps we can discuss this in a more appropriate setting. If you're truly a major shareholder, you deserve to be heard. But ambushing a board meeting is," Elena interrupted. "Inappropriate? Like mocking someone for cleaning coffee that you spilled? Like treating people as invisible because their work doesn't match your definition of important? I've earned my voice in this room through investing millions of dollars into this company. The question isn't whether I'll be heard, the question is whether you'll still be here to hear it. My coalition is calling an emergency shareholder meeting to vote on new board members and leadership. You have 2 weeks to prepare your defense for why you should keep your positions. I suggest you use that time more productively than you've used this evening." The fallout from Elena's dramatic reveal was immediate and transformative. The story leaked to business media within hours. Someone in that room, recognizing a career-defining moment, had shared it with reporters. By the next morning, Elena Petrova's story was front-page news. "Janitor reveals she's major shareholder. Plans takeover," read one headline. Immigrant cleaning woman built fortune while working night shift, declared another. The coverage was universally sympathetic to Elena and brutal toward the executives who dismissed her. Think pieces were written about class assumptions, about invisible labor, about how successful people often succeed through circumstances and connections rather than merit, while people like Elena, genuinely brilliant and hardworking, remain invisible because they lack the markers that society uses to identify worth. The emergency shareholder meeting that Elena had demanded took place 3 weeks later, and it was unprecedented in corporate history. Major institutional investors, having read Elena's analysis and compared it to the existing management's track record, sided with her coalition. The vote wasn't even close. Elena's slate of new board members was elected with 67% shareholder approval. Richard Brennan was removed as CEO, along with most of his executive team, including Bradley Henderson, whose viral moment as the man who'd mocked his future boss had made him professionally radioactive. Elena was elected chairman of the board, and she immediately installed a new CEO, a brilliant operations executive who'd been overlooked for promotion repeatedly despite consistently delivering results, because she was a woman and didn't fit the traditional CEO image. Under Elena's leadership, Ameritech Solutions rejected the undervalued takeover offer and implemented her restructuring plan. Within 18 months, the company's stock price had tripled, vindicating Elena's strategy and making her personal stake worth over $200 million. More significantly, she'd transformed the company's culture. Elena implemented policies requiring management to spend time understanding jobs at every level of the company. She dramatically increased wages for the lowest-paid workers, arguing correctly that people stressed about survival couldn't do their best work. She diversified hiring and promotion practices to include people from non-traditional backgrounds who'd been systematically excluded from opportunities. And perhaps most symbolically, she continued to personally clean the executive offices once a month, not because she needed to, but as a reminder to everyone, herself included, that no work is beneath dignity and no person should be invisible. Elena's story sparked a movement that extended far beyond one company. Other organizations began examining their own assumptions about who had valuable insights and perspectives. Several companies implemented reverse mentoring programs, where frontline workers taught executives about operational realities that management had been blind to. There was increased discussion about invisible labor, the work that keeps society functioning, but that society treats as unskilled and unworthy of respect or fair compensation. And Elena became a powerful voice advocating for immigrants, for workers in service industries, and for the fundamental principle that human worth isn't defined by job titles or social status. Bradley Henderson's career never recovered. The video of him mocking Elena, recorded by a junior executive on his phone, had gone viral with tens of millions of views, and Henderson became a symbol of privileged incompetence and casual cruelty. No company wanted to hire someone with that public image. Henderson eventually left corporate America entirely, and by multiple accounts spent significant time reflecting on how his assumptions and behavior had destroyed his career. In one interview years later, Henderson admitted, "I thought I was successful because I was talented and hardworking. Elena Petrova taught me that I'd succeeded because of privilege, connections, and a system designed to reward people like me regardless of actual merit. The most painful lesson was recognizing that the woman I'd dismissed as beneath me was more intelligent, more hardworking, and more deserving of success than I'd ever been." Elena used her wealth and platform to create opportunities for others who'd been systematically excluded from success. She established a foundation providing business education and seed funding for immigrant entrepreneurs, recognizing that many people in America possess skills and knowledge that went unrecognized because they lacked connections or credentials that American institutions valued. She funded programs teaching financial literacy and investment strategies to service workers, believing that people shouldn't have to be exceptional like her to build economic security. And she became a vocal advocate for changing immigration policies to recognize professional credentials earned abroad, arguing that America was wasting incredible human capital by forcing highly skilled immigrants into menial labor because their degrees and experience didn't count. 10 years after that boardroom confrontation, Elena Petrova was 72 years old and worth over $500 million through her continued investment success. She'd long since stopped working as a janitor, but she spoke frequently about those years and what they'd taught her. In interviews, Elena emphasized that her story wasn't about individual exceptionalism, it was about systemic failures that kept talented people trapped in positions beneath their capabilities while mediocre people rose through privilege. She'd say that for every immigrant like her who managed to overcome barriers, there were thousands who didn't, but who deserved to. Her message wasn't anyone can succeed if they work hard enough. It was we've created a society that wastes human potential by judging people based on credentials, connections, and social markers rather than actual capability. If you take one lesson from Elena Petrova's story, let it be this. Every person you encounter has depths you can't see, experiences you don't know, and capabilities that aren't visible in their current circumstances. When those executives mocked the janitor cleaning their conference room, they weren't just being cruel to one woman, they were revealing their own limitations, their inability to see beyond surface appearances and recognize worth that didn't announce itself with expensive suits and prestigious job titles. Elena's triumph wasn't just about financial success or corporate takeover. It was about proving that dignity doesn't come from others' recognition, but from knowing your own worth, and that the people society treats as invisible often see more clearly than those blinded by privilege. Here's what you should do. First, examine how you treat people whose jobs society devalues: service workers, custodial staff, anyone doing labor that you benefit from but rarely think about. Do you see them as people with full lives, histories, and capabilities? Or are they invisible to you? Second, question your assumptions about who's qualified, who's intelligent, who deserves respect. Those assumptions are usually based on social conditioning rather than actual assessment of capability. Third, if you're in a position of power, create systems that identify and elevate talented people from non-traditional backgrounds who've been systematically excluded from opportunities. And finally, remember that every time you treat someone as less than fully human because their current circumstances don't match your definition of success, you're revealing more about your limitations than theirs. If Elena's story inspired you, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about people who prove that worth isn't defined by others' recognition. Share this with anyone who's been underestimated, dismissed, or treated as invisible because their work or background didn't match society's narrow definitions of value. Drop a comment telling us about times you've been underestimated or about someone whose capabilities surprised you once you actually paid attention. Because Elena Petrova's boardroom triumph proves that the most dangerous assumption you can make is that you know someone's worth based on their job title, and that the people you don't see are often the ones who see everything.